Until it was remastered and released for modern consoles in March of 2020, Doom 64 was a relatively unknown entry in the series. And I would argue that even after all that, it still doesn't get the credit nor carry the weight in the franchise that it should. Because as much as it circulated when it was a pre-order bonus for Doom Eternal and released standalone shortly after, it was quickly overshadowed by Doom Eternal, which I'm not saying is wrong because Doom Eternal, it was and still is a big deal, but the buzz for Doom 64 died down as soon as it hit the limelight again. Without spoiling too much, Doom Eternal did fill in the blanks with the canon and the lore of the Doom series in that it cemented Doom 64 as the canonical third entry in the series, while Doom 3 remains somewhat debated with the community as far as how or if it fits into the canon. And even Hugo Martin himself has said it's tough. I think Doom 3 is a really good game that's fun to go back to, but is basically a different genre and take on the series that was and still is very divisive among fans of the series. And those that love it are even divisive among themselves. Should the flashlight be on at all times along with the weapons like you get in the BFG edition or Half-Life 2? Or should you be forced to use the flashlight independently like the original version? Like I said, it's divisive. I think id Software, both the employees at the time and those that later became a part of the modern team, all do have a soft spot in their hearts and minds for Doom 3, but they know that the true roots of Doom are ripping and tearing their way through the hordes of hell, and that Doom 3 was ultimately more a product of what they wanted to advance and show off of their technology versus a want to advance the Doom series as a whole. And Doom 3 simply became a really good catalyst for that technology. It was actually not the first id game to fall into that category. Quake 2 was originally unrelated and had a working title of War, spelled W-O-R, but the Quake name was eventually slapped on it to help with the marketing and perception versus risking an all-new IP, which nobody was even really confident of the name of. For the longest time, and probably even still, some of the most die-hard fans of the Doom community either didn't know Doom 64 existed or assumed it was just another console port of the original, give or take a few levels, as pretty much every console port had to that point, and had done so with inferior quality to that of the PC version. With the endless list of unlicensed custom WADs and megawads that had satisfied the PC-based community wanting more content that is still growing to this day, you can't really blame them for overlooking Doom 64. There were eventually at least a few fan-made PC ports, and great ones at that. You had Doom 64 TC in 2003, Doom 64 EX releasing in the summer of 2008, and eventually even a brutal variety as well in 2016. But Doom 64 was never available to the broader market of home consoles until Hugo Martin and company over at id Software saw fit to partner with Night Dive Studios and give this entry some well-deserved attention. Before we talk much more about Doom 64, it's important to lay the foundation of Doom 64 via even lesser-known title in the series. Doom for the original PlayStation. Released on November 16, 1995, this game was developed by mostly the same team at Williams prior to being redubbed as Midway, that would later go on to develop Doom 64, Quake 64, and even some of the same personnel that made up Raster Productions, which would later go on to develop console ports of Quake 2 for N64, Quake 3 for the Sega Dreamcast, and lastly, Return to Castle Wolfenstein for PS2. The PlayStation box art here cites itself as the custom PlayStation edition, and even sports some new art using an armorless iteration of Doom Guy from the Doom 2 box art. The difference here is that this is a port but with a handful of exclusive maps replacing some existing maps, with the map count altogether slightly reduced, different monster placement including putting some Doom 2 monsters within Doom 1 maps, a vastly different visual style with various colored lightings that dynamically change the player and monster sprites, and last but certainly not least, a masterful ambient soundtrack by Aubrey Hodges that wonderfully plays off the new visual style and replaces Bobby Prince's original metal, grunge-infused soundtrack. And they completely remove the arch file from either game's maps. Doom for the PS1 makes several changes that we won't go into all the detail of here, but the main thing I want to talk about are the lighting and sound design. The PS1 version of Doom makes heavy use of colored lighting and ramps up some of the strobe effects of the original version. On the original MS-DOS Doom, you had some areas that did at least have varied lightings, but those were completely from the perspective of simply turning down the brightness of a few areas and maybe adding a few strobe effects. Don't get me wrong, those were great for the time, but the PS1 version takes this concept a step further and warps it into a more horror-based atmosphere. To add to that concept is Aubrey Hodges' amazing ambient soundtrack. Bobby Prince's original soundtrack meshed very well with the fast-paced demon-slaying gameplay of the original, but this dark and brooding soundtrack embraces the new aesthetic that the team at Williams implemented. In addition to the new soundtrack are completely new enemy and weapon sounds almost across the board. Your weapons arguably have a more bite to their sound, and the enemy sounds have been redone with arguably deeper and grittier sound effects. The PS1 version of Doom, while gaining some well-deserved notoriety over the years, has also been covered by great YouTubers out there. I recommend checking out videos by GmanLives, Stop Skeletons from Fighting, and I mean like 10 years ago Happy Video Game Nerd Days. He did it first. And even Caddicarus covered this version. So while I'm not going into all the details today for this version of Doom, I highly recommend checking out these videos to get your fix on PS1 Doom. Simply put, I think there's a great spin on the classic Doom with some exclusive levels sprinkled in, arguably some of the lesser original levels removed, and completely revamped atmosphere with the visuals and sound design. I think any Doom fan should give this game a try on the original hardware, if you can afford it. And all this is to say that this game set the stage for Doom 64. Released in March of 1997, Doom 64 was an updated version and somewhat unique take on the already tried and true formula, and it was the next logical step in the direction that Williams took with PS1 Doom. Development had initially begun in late '94 while PS1 Doom was well underway, and id was supervising the project. Being planned as a new title from the start, the game was originally titled simply Absolution to set it apart, but it was later titled as Doom 64 for brand recognition. Personally, I think Doom Absolution would have been better off, as I think simply calling it Doom 64 is a huge part of what ultimately led to it flying under the radar. I would be interested to know if the title Doom 3 was ever proposed, as I think that would have really helped catapult it into the spotlight. But with it not being developed by id directly, I would assume Carmack and company may have had some apprehension there, and I couldn't find any sources stating that Doom 3 was ever in the cards as a potential name. Doom 64 features 32 exclusive maps, 31 new levels, plus a remake of Doom 2's Dead Simple if you want to be picky. It has 4 difficulty levels and is missing the Nightmare difficulty. While I don't know for a fact, I would guess the N64 may not have been able to handle the respawning enemies that come packaged with the Nightmare difficulty, and I'm not sure the non-PC crowd were that broken up about it. And honestly, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really fit in with this style of game anyway. Doom 64 offers some nice updated monster sprites. I think the taller, more detailed sprites are an excellent look for the game and have aged relatively well. The monsters look more threatening with their taller statures, and as silly as it sounds, better defined muscular look. I specifically point to the new imps and pinky demons here. They just look so much more threatening now than they've used to. Along with the completely revamped monster sprites, it has a partially new enemy in the Nightmare Imp and a new boss with the Mother Demon. But it is missing the Chain Gunner, Archvile, and Revenant. I don't personally miss the Hit Scanner Deluxe that is the Chain Gunner, nor the Demon Resurrecting Archvile, but I do miss the Revenant and its homing rockets. I think Midway's updated enemy sprites would have been interesting with the Revenant above all others. Doom 64 has some turrets in later levels that fire homing rockets, so maybe that was their love letter to a monster that they either could not make work in the game due to limitations, or simply did not want to. I think the updated Pain Elemental looks pretty cool, but I would have gladly traded the Revenant for the Pain Elemental any day of the week. Much like the enemies, all weapons have completely revamped looks and sounds. In general, most of the weapon models are much higher in detail. You get a new chainsaw with 2 blades versus 1, and it just absolutely wrecks shop in the right situations. Unfortunately, the reload animation for the Super Shotgun is MIA, but it still packs a huge punch and sounds great. The chain gun now has blue flames for a muzzle flash, and while it is just the pistol sound on repeat, it does of course sound very pronounced and really makes you feel like you're mowing down demons left and right. The plasma gun and BFG look excellent with the highest detail models of any in the game, but the plasma rifle's recoil animation is unfortunately absent as well. But the real trophy here is Doom 64's all-new weapon, the Unmaker. This weapon shares ammo with the plasma rifle and the BFG, but it can be upgraded to fire as many as 3 beams simultaneously and therefore triple its damage output. Via the demon keys that can be found in the secret levels, the fully upgraded version of this weapon can be downright game-breaking, even on the harder difficulties. Doom 64 also features completely customizable button mapping. If you have seen my Quake 64 video, you'll know how I feel about how Midway treated controller setups on their id Software games, as well as how GoldenEye's 1.2 control style set the precedent for how all FPSs would ultimately control. You get that same freedom here, and no matter your preferences, Doom 64 can be bent to your will to control like a dream, or as close as you can get to it with the N64 controller. While Doom 64 obviously isn't on the same level of 3D as Turok, given Doom doesn't have to worry about vertical aiming, I would argue that any and all FPS on the N64 should have tried to emulate the freedom that Doom 64 and later id titles offered. And I would also argue that Turok's control schemes, while certainly options that were a big deal for the time and forcing full 3D controls on all players, have not aged all that well when you revisit the original. Doom 64 also offers both memory card saving and password entry. Unsurprisingly, there is no saving mid-level, so you won't be doing any save scumming here. But you can eventually unlock a features menu with cheats and a level select if you manage to find the secret hectic map and complete it. Now let's dive into that gameplay. The first thing you'll probably notice is Doom 64 is dark. If you are playing the original N64 version, you will undoubtedly have to at least turn up the in-game brightness and most likely even adjust your screen. At the minimum brightness, this game is borderline unplayable. This was obviously an intentional choice by the team at Midway, but some of the levels are made extremely difficult by the pitch black segments that are hard to navigate. Obviously to each their own, but I would think that most people turn the brightness up at least in-game if not also on their TV. This was of course rectified in the fan-made PC ports as well as the official remaster by Night Dive. The first third or so of the game is unsurprisingly made up of UAC base levels, but they do come with a slight twist on the original two games' UAC levels. If you've played Doom 64, you likely know the sparse story, but basically this game takes place quote-unquote years after Doom 2, and the original Phobos and Deimos bases have been quarantined and bombarded with astronomical levels of radiation to ensure no living thing could ever survive. The Mother Demon has survived and resurrected all the previously slain soldiers and demons to continue the unfinished business. So you and the Marine from the original two games are being sent in to handle the situation. These UAC levels do an awesome job of giving off a vibe of years of decay and abandonment. Gone are the brightly lit hallways and bright overcast skies outside. Everything now has a brown, rusty, and dirty look to it, and most rooms are only dimly lit with a few light sources. And instead of the bright sky and mountainous backgrounds, we only get a dimly lit night sky littered with stars. While these muddy brown wall textures and doors can get repetitive or look bland, these levels make heavy use of colored lighting. From reds, blues, yellows, and different strobe effects, the variety of light sources do an awesome job of mixing things up among the repetitive hallway textures. After 8 levels, not counting any secret levels anyway, you then encounter the portal to Hell. I think it was a good idea for this game not to linger too long in the UAC levels, as we've seen enough of those throughout the original 2 and even the PS1 Doom if you want to count it. I kind of wish they could have recycled at least one map from the original to give you a true sense of retreading this base, but I fully understand why they wanted to leave the UAC maps as completely original. The Hell levels start off with a sort of remake of Doom 2's Dead Simple, with the aptly titled Even Simpler. As far as monsters, power-ups, and weapons, this map throws everything at you. Mancubus, Hell Knights, Barons, Cacodemons, Pain Elementals, Lost Souls, tons of ammo pickups, armor, supercharge, and even an invulnerability sphere. This map is jam-packed gauntlet that shows no mercy. After the key hunting and tight corridors of the UAC levels, you get to let loose and circle strafe to your heart's content. While I think Doom 64 had already set itself apart to this point in the game with the darker atmosphere, revamped visuals, as well as the deep sound design, this is where the game really takes off. The Hell levels are this game's specialty. The varied skyboxes from reds and purples, the lightning strikes and crashing thunder, the complex gothic architecture, the later levels almost look like that of Quake more than they do Doom. But I can't deny that this is also where the game can lose some of its audience if you really are not that into it after the first few big maps. These environments become massive and sprawling, and they often end with a less than straightforward switch and sprint puzzle. A hidden passageway that opens up on the other side of the map like a hexen puzzle, or even a final monster closet or spawn trap after 20 minutes of progress that nukes you in seconds and sends you back to the start. Growing up with Doom 64 and Quake 64, I don't personally have a problem with this aspect. Quick saves on PC and modern day shooters are a luxury, but they're not always a necessity. But that does not necessarily justify some of the level design here. I can justify and understand why it would not be everyone's cup of tea, but I also enjoy just how deep and endless some of these levels can seem. Dungeons that tunnel downward forever, isolating you further and further into the game's world. Towering Gothic castles that reach further and further into the sky, dark labyrinthian temples that take you prisoner before you even enter them. The level design in the second half of this game is complex, unforgiving, and not for the faint of heart. They do not go so far as Hexen as far as how convoluted and confusing those interconnected maps can be, but make no mistake, you can easily get lost and spend a lot of time meandering in the later levels if it's your first playthrough. This is furthered by the multiple difficulty options. The 4 difficulties here are classified as easiest, easier, harder, and hardest. The jump from Bring It On to I Own Doom is pretty intense, and while there is no nightmare difficulty, Watch Me Die is about as much as anyone can handle. The number of enemies on I Own Doom absolutely skyrockets, and I will say the name of the game is Hell Knights and Hit Scanners. All Doom games start off heavy with zombie men and shotgun sergeants, but this game never really drops them. And once you get to map 5 or 6, this game is filled to the brim with Hell Knights. There aren't as many imps or peaky demons as I would expect, and the game just kind of escalates to Hell Knights and Barons everywhere. The super shotgun is your friend here. From crowd control to taking on the bigger monsters like Barons and the Mancubus, it handles it all. The rocket launcher is obviously the most effective here, but Doom 64's tight and complex level geometry really keep the rocket launcher from being safe to use all that often. Even playing it all these years, I still find myself accidentally blowing myself up on a corner or a wall that is barely even visible in the really tight FOV. So I spend most of my time managing enemies with the super shotgun and plasma rifle, and then leveraging the chain gun for lost souls and pain elementals. I guess the increase in knights and barons is possibly due to the lack of revenants, but overall I think this game could have used more imps and pinkies. Gripes about the monster variety aside, I think the second half of the game has some absolute gems as far as the level design goes, and presents true challenge to even the most seasoned of fans. The secret level In the Void being my personal favorite, and on that note, this game makes truly good use of the secret levels in a way that previous games have not. Not only can you find the exclusive weapon the Unmaker, you can obtain what are called Demon Keys. These are not only to upgrade the Unmaker, but they also come into play reducing the difficulty of the final boss fight with the Mother Demon. And honestly, it can make it almost too easy. But I think that is rewarding for all that you have been through to that point. The only other gripe I really ever have is I think the collision detection is just ever so slightly off on this game. Too often you'll be trying to make a getaway through a tight hallway after a monster or 5 spawn in, and you'll get caught on a corner or an archway. In the previous games, it kind of felt like you got an ever so subtle bounce off of the wall or corner in this situation, and your momentum would carry you off the wall or corner you ever so slightly grazed to keep you moving. But here you will get stuck fairly often in those hectic situations, and you have no help from the game or your momentum. And when that happens, you are most likely a sitting duck. The other aspect of the collision detection is I feel it is sometimes too picky on when it actually wants to acknowledge that you picked up an item or not. This is especially prevalent with the smaller items like health or armor bonuses or a small set of shells or a magazine. Maybe the original games were more generous than I realized with how much room you had to grab any pickups, but I feel that Doom 64 can be a little too precise at times. And when you are needing to move quickly, as you so often are in this game, it can really hurt you in the moment of having to double back for an item and compromise your distance from a given enemy. Overall, I think the team at Midway really gave it their all with this game. All new maps, an exclusive weapon, bringing over the darker, revamped sound design from Doom, and updating visuals for basically all manner of sprites and environments. They laid the foundation for their vision with their spin on Doom for the PS1, and they fleshed it out more than just a new coat of paint with Doom 64. While I think it will only get more respect as time goes on given its remaster and how well it has aged, it is a shame that Doom 64 did not get as much notoriety during its release back in the day. But I think it is undeniable that Doom 64 helped somewhat lay a foundation for what Doom 3 would eventually become. This is a game that any fan of the series should check out if they have not already. I will of course have to say my best recommendation would be Night Dive's remaster, or Doom 64 EX, given those inherently look, sound, and play better than the original cartridge version. And with Doom 64's enhanced variety of difficulty and various traps and monsters spawning in from all angles, I also have to give the nod to those later versions on the basis of quick saves. I know I mentioned earlier that they were part of the experience and frankly a limitation of consoles back then, and nobody's going to force you to use them if you don't want. but as a father of 4, a husband, and frankly a gamer that is behind on his backlog by years, I just don't really have time to justify punishing myself over and over when playing on the harder difficulties on the original hardware. Starting each level over and over can break the experience for some, and while that is not where I land, I do still recommend making use of quick saves if you're playing this for the experience more than the challenge. These levels can be massive like Doom 2 and can be punishing like Quake. So if you have to budget your time as a gamer, I recommend a lower difficulty or using quick saves on a higher difficulty. But whatever your preference, I wholeheartedly think this is a game that any fan of the genre should try sooner rather than later. I thank you for watching, and I hope you had as much fun as I did.